Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia.
It's my pleasure to welcome to the podcast today Professor Andrew Thatcher, who is the current chair of Industrial and Organisational Psychology, I think, Andrew, and your university is?
The University of the Witwatersrand, or Witwatersrand.
In Johannesburg.
Which is in Johannesburg in South Africa, yes.
And Andrew and I have known each other for many years through the IEA, and we'll talk a bit further about the IEA in the podcast later. But Andrew, maybe just start off, tell us a little bit about Andrew Thatcher and how you became involved in this HFE industry.
The ergonomics, human factors and ergonomics. A story that actually starts with me driving into university on my first day of university. And on the radio was this funny English gentleman by the name of James Fisher, who was talking about ergonomics. And I arrived in my first class, which was a psychology class, and who should be there but James Fisher. It turns out that he'd ended up studying ergonomics at Loughborough University. He's from the UK. And I ended up, through my career, ended up doing my postgraduate studies with him as my supervisor. So my first project, my master's research project, my undergraduate research project was on shift work and the impact of shift work on workers. My master's ended up flying me in a little aeroplane off to the northern part of the country where we sat down and we worked with a coal-fired power station, looking at the design of the control room of this coal-fired power station. They were moving from a gigantic mock-up at the time to these sort of computer-based systems, and they needed to understand what implications that would have for the control operators. And then my PhD was a sort of an extension of this cognitive ergonomics, or at least interface design areas. I started looking at electronic databases, wayfinding through electronic databases, and the big database that was coming up at the time was the World Wide Web, and so we used that as the basis for understanding wayfinding and information seeking through these sort of large scale electronic databases of information. That's basically my journey. I finished off the PhD with a passionate interest in the human factors and ergonomics aspects.
Well done to you. And then I understand your career took an interesting turn. Maybe your wife was involved in this. Tell me a little bit about
yes,
that.
Indeed. So I mean, like any good PhD student, when you finish your PhD and you sort of start on an academic career, you carry on with what you know. And for 4 to 5 years after finishing my PhD, I dutifully followed that role. Publishing in areas of cognitive ergonomics and interface design, looking at new and emerging technologies. And it became increasingly frustrating, I found, because the way in which human factors works, well, certainly in South Africa, is we're very rarely involved in the early design process. You know, the design process happens in other countries, and we import the technology, and we have to look at the impact of that technology on people, which is essentially what I was doing. But by the time the research is finished, the technology's moved on. So you're constantly producing research which is redundant. But around about the same time, my wife took as you say, my wife was involved with this one. My wife took a jump from working in the travel industry to working in the sustainable built environment. And I took a bit of a jump along with her because at the same time, South Africa was developing its Green Building Council using a rating system which actually was taken off the Australians called the Green Star rating system. We had to adapt some things for the South African context. Most especially the fact that our transport networks are not nearly as sophisticated as they are in most Australian cities. And one of the questions that they were asking, when we're sitting down was, if we build these green buildings, are they better for people? And I'm thinking, that's what I do. That's our work. That's what we do in human factors and ergonomics. We look at the impact of a piece of technology, in this case a building, on people, and to see whether it actually does make a difference. And if it doesn't make a difference, how do we change it to make a difference? And so I made this slow, over a period of 3 years, move from looking at the sort of advanced technologies and the sort of more frustrating work into this work on sustainability and trying to understand how we might create more sustainable systems for people that would be better for people and better for the environment. And that's pretty much what I've been doing for the last 15, 20 years now.
Before we talk about some of the other applications of this, just with the green building area, what's been the uptake like in South Africa, and what role would the ergonomists play with companies wishing to get this accreditation?
So, I mean, luckily I was involved as they were developing these tools. So, the one thing which was happening at the time, largely led by Alan Hedge in the US, was about inserting ergonomics credits into these rating tools. So, we have, as Australia does, ergonomics credits in the building rating tools. There are a couple of ways in which human factors and ergonomics links in. So the first is just in terms of ergonomics, in terms of ergonomic procurement of things like furniture and fit outs and that sort of thing. The second one is in terms of design of workspace. How do we make workspace efficient so that it doesn't use up too much space, but that is actually efficient for the workers? And then the third way is through things like indoor environmental quality, making sure that the aspects of indoor environmental quality are not harmful, but in fact motivate productivity in people. So in those three ways, at least in the South African system, we have three ways in which human factors and ergonomics professionals might be involved in assessing what is happening inside green buildings, and to help encourage people who are building green buildings or are renovating buildings to become green, to incorporate the human elements into the design of these buildings and this built environment.
I attended one of your lectures actually in Langkawi some years ago, and you were talking at that stage about sustainability and a broader area of climate change and the relationship that our area of ergonomics may have in that space. It was fascinating, Andrew, but tell us a little bit more about that area of your work.
So, I mean, without going into too much detail, if people are interested, they can read about this. But essentially, there are two pathways. I think from a design perspective, and I think of human factors and ergonomics as a design discipline. The first one is mitigation, and the second one is adaptation. So, I'm not going to talk about climate change. Climate change is happening. I'm not going to even debate about whether that's a fact. It is a fact. It'll have various different impacts around the world. So that's another thing to acknowledge. Some parts of the world will hardly feel any differences. Some parts of the world will have positive impacts. For example, there'll be more rain. There'll be more arable land, for example. Other areas will be negatively impacted. So the impacts will be various. The scary thing is the rate of change, and while human beings are adaptable, the rate at which things are changing is going to be pretty scary. We're talking in the line of decades, not years or months or minutes. But generally, climate changes over hundreds of years, not generally over decades. So this is going to be quite a rapid change, which we need to adapt to. So from a mitigation pathway, essentially what we're doing is looking at how we might use human factors and ergonomics to help design technologies and work practices and behaviors to actually start to help us slow down the process of human impacted climate change. So that would mean, doing things like, how do we become more resource effective? In this particular case, energy is the main source. How do we become more energy efficient in all of our practices, our work practices, our practices at home, and to adopt technologies which are more energy efficient? Mm-hmm. Probably the more obvious way to look at this is in terms of adaptation. So there are a number of different impacts. The most obvious one is heat, and this is an area which will impact Australia the most. So there may be some areas of Australia which become so hot that they become inhabitable. There already are areas which are largely uninhabitable, I should say, in Australia, and those areas are going to grow. And so we need to think about how do we adapt to those types of conditions. It might not seem like very much, to have a 2, a 3, or even a 4 or 5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. But that's the average. We've got to look at what the extremes might be. So 4 or 5 degrees Celsius increase in average temperature might mean a 10 or a 12 degree increase in the maximums, or the maxima. Which would mean that sometimes somewhere in the year it's not going to be possible to go outside. And then, of course, in Australia, the types of things that you might need to look at are things like loss of tourism because of sea level rises. All those cities which sit along the sea might not exist in 30 or 40 years' time, certainly by the end of the century. And the particular thing which ends up happening is carbon dioxide gets absorbed into the oceans. The oceans become more acidic. And the greatest tourist attraction, arguably, that Australia has is the Great Barrier Reef. And we already start to see how that is affected by coral bleaching because of the amount of acidity in the ocean. And so you might lose hundreds of thousands of jobs in the tourism industry. And how do we adapt to those types of changes?
And if we take the adaptation down to the work level, if we've got people working in excessive heat, like road repair workers or agricultural workers, we look at the metabolic rate, we look at the clothing they wear, we look at the hydration requirements.
Yes, I mean, getting all the way down to the work situation. There's a whole range of different things. We can look at technologies. So how do we insert technologies in there to help the worker in those types of situations? So perhaps more automation in things where it is possible, perhaps in agriculture, so that you're not exposing the worker to excessive heat. We look at organisational ergonomics type issues, and that is how do we organise when work takes place. In other words, you might have to adapt strategies where you're working at the cooler parts of the day rather than in the heat of the day. And so you look at when work is taking place, who is working, how long people are working for, the types of rest breaks that you might need to insert into that process. And then you might start looking at personal protection. So that might mean things like cooling vests, issues around other types of cooling stations. You might have to insert cooling stations around in particular areas. I'm thinking about road workers and having construction workers in roads or construction workers in buildings, to be able to protect them from the worst effects of the heat.
Just broadening that to your research on ergonomics and the future of work, you've been involved in a number of publications looking more broadly about the future of work. What are some of the examples of that you've been looking at?
Yeah, so I mean, this was a lovely study. I always love this work where you're working with people from around the world, because what you soon understand is that what is imperative for your area of the world isn't necessarily even a consideration somewhere else. So it is about understanding these sorts of national and international and regional and geographical differences. But I mean, we're seeing some interesting trends coming up. I mean, we talk about climate change, and sustainability is one of these trends coming up. The other one is the issue around work and work casualization or work informalization.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly in somewhere like Australia, you're starting to see new forms of work come up where organizations are taking less responsibility for the well-being of the workers and outsourcing that to the workers themselves. And that's what's happening in these sorts of informalizations. The other area, obviously, is in terms of technology. The big one we talk about at the moment is artificial intelligence. I imagine in 5 years' time it'll be something else. But at the moment, artificial intelligence and automated systems and the impact that might have on jobs, workers' jobs, it certainly changes the job for most workers. At the very least, it makes it a lot more cognitive than physical, which has generally been a trend over the last 50 years. And this takes it to a new level, where you almost have an intelligent cognitive agent that you're interacting with. And so we need to understand the impacts of that. So I mean, there's a lot of really interesting things. If you get to read the paper, it outlines what these are and what the implications might be for human factors and ergonomics design. For me, the interesting thing was looking at how two things, how they are linked internationally. So what happens in one part of the world is actually linked to something else which is happening in some other part of the world. But the impacts are different. So for example, what we might find with artificial intelligence, some parts of the world are going to be largely benefit from artificial intelligence because of how sophisticated and how educated the populations already are. So populations like in Taiwan and Japan and South Korea are already making these sorts of enormous investments in their education systems, and they're also developing the technology. They're going to see an increase in jobs and job opportunities, whereas other parts of the world are going to see a loss of job opportunities as artificial intelligence starts taking over some of the more menial or mundane tasks, and organizations decide that they don't need those people anymore in the organization, and they're not trainable into the more sophisticated jobs which are going to come. So these things are related to one another.
I know one of the areas, maybe because of your work at the university, is the future generation moving into our industry and areas of research. And what we're finding in Australia at the moment is university courses are becoming less rather than more. What are you observing around the world in terms of the future of our discipline and the next generation?
So, I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about human factors and ergonomics courses. So got this wonderful role in the International Ergonomics Association at the moment, which enables you to give this sort of big picture view of what's going on. So, I mean, I think there's two trends which are happening, and again, they are related to one another. So there are some parts of the world which are growing exponentially, and new ergonomics courses are being developed and implemented all the time. And those two areas, interestingly enough, are Asia and South America. And there we're seeing enormous growth in both the number of federated ergonomics and human factors societies, a growth in the number of courses which are being offered, and an exponential growth in the membership of these societies, which is quite interesting, because in other parts of the world, particularly North America, Europe, and Australia, or at least Australasia, or maybe not really that, it's Australia and New Zealand, we're seeing a shrinking. So we see the shrinking of courses, we see the shrinking of in some places of membership, and so we've got these two things which are happening. So we have in some sense, an old world where human factors and ergonomics formally is shrinking, and the new world where formally it's growing. So there is an interesting thing which sits behind this, and this is a paper which was written by Jan Dull and colleagues published in 2012, but commissioned by the International Ergonomics Association to talk about the future of ergonomics, it was called. And one of the things that they recommend in that paper is the strengthening of high quality education programs. So what you've seen in these new parts of the world, and especially in Asia and South America, is the sort of investment in high quality education programs, whereas the people who haven't followed that advice and haven't invested, and I'm talking now about societies rather than individual people, where the societies haven't been engaged in defending the courses, we see a shrinking of the number of courses which are ending up happening. Now, there's only so much that a membership, professional membership society can do to convince a university that a particular course is important, but there is a lot that a membership society can do to make sure that people are encouraged to take professional courses. So I think there are, if I talk about what this might mean going forward for federated societies, it might mean that federated societies take on some of this education themselves. It might mean that we develop international or online courses, or it might mean almost the opposite of what happens in the early days of human factors and ergonomics, where people came from places like Brazil to France, or from, if I'm thinking about the course in Luleå in Sweden, where Hushang Shanavaz attracted all the people from industrially developing countries to come across to Sweden to study human factors and ergonomics. It might actually happen that in order to keep our discipline going, we'll find Australians going off to China or to Vietnam to do a course in human factors and ergonomics. So I think there's a number of different possible models here. There isn't one single solution, but definitely see things changing. I don't see human factors and ergonomics dying. I see it being integrated, perhaps more into existing types of courses. Perhaps we might see human factors and ergonomics being better integrated into engineering degrees, for example, or architectural degrees or design degrees, depending on what's available in a particular country.
Okay, fascinating, Andrew. I know one of the areas that IEA's been negotiating with Australia is the separation of the certification model from the society's governance. Do you want to give us a bit of an idea of what globally is happening with certification?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, maybe just a little bit of background on here. So again, coming from the Dull paper, one of the things which it looked at was high quality professionalization. And so what the International Ergonomics Association did they woke up one morning and decided to do this over a number of years, looked at other professional programs around the world, other professional degree programs, professionalization. And what you find in these situations is that the certification or the professional recognition becomes separated from the professional bodies. So what you do, let me take medicine as an example. You will find that the professional registration for medicine is separate from an organization where you might join as a professional member to, for example, do continuing professional education. And you find the same thing happening in most professions. There are some exceptions, but in most professions around the world. And so that became built into the International Ergonomics Association's recommendations for certification bodies. Now, the International Ergonomics Association is really just looking at things internationally and what is international best practice. We don't dictate to a country what it is they should be doing. We make suggestions. And so what we see is when a program is certified, it's certified for a period of time. When that is endorsed by the IEA, it's endorsed for a period of time, and then if they ask for re-endorsement, we then give them suggestions and input on what is best practice. And so, in the interim, from when Australia was endorsed by the IEA till when it's looking at re-endorsement, this is one of the things that has changed. And for most of the existing certification programs, so I'm thinking, the Chartered Institute, the Japanese Ergonomics Society, Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, the certification system was embodied in the membership society. Now that in itself isn't a problem. Because there are ways in which it can be incorporated into a society but have a separate governance structure. So that's really just what we're looking at. Now, most of the new certification systems which are being endorsed by the IEA have this built in. That they're able to do that from the beginning. Which makes it a lot easier. Trying to fix something which is already there, change something which is already there, as we know from human factors and ergonomics, is much more difficult than redesigning it from scratch, or at least designing it from scratch to be separate. So we're seeing a bit of an ergonomic problem or issue with societies who are wishing to change, but it is quite easy to do that. I mean, the interesting exception to that actually is the United States, whose BCPE, I think it is, was built up as being separate from the very beginning. I think that they had taken their guidelines from the engineering degrees where it was separate. And so they built it as separate from the beginning. So the US already has that. So someone like Australia and the UK, they're having to adapt their system. But the newer ones which are coming on board are just adopting that from the beginning. And it's fairly easy for them to do that.
One of the things that you mentioned about the growth areas in Latin America and Asia in education, tell us a little bit about the networks of countries collaborating together and opportunities there.
The way in which we try to organise internationally is at two levels. The first is individual societies and how individual societies might operate and collaborate together. But more recently, certainly over the last 10 years, we've thought about how we might get regional areas to collaborate with one another, because what we find is in regional areas there are a lot of shared interests, a lot of shared concerns, and perhaps a lot of shared resources which can end up happening. In the case of somewhere like South America, there's a lot of shared language, for example, which really does help them grow. And so what we decided to do in the International Ergonomics Association was create regional networks and encourage the regional networks to collaborate with one another. I mean, from a resource perspective, this makes a big difference, because it means that you have regional people there. If they need to travel, the travel costs are much less. They're very often quite familiar with the types of challenges that you get in a particular regional area. And so what has happened over time is we've encouraged the organic growth of these networks. And so you find one in South America, ULERGO, the Latin American Ergonomics Society networks. In Asia, it's the ACD, Asian Committee on Ergonomic and Design. And there's also another one called ASEAN, which is sort of Southeast Asia, but that one's being sort of incorporated into ACD. In Europe, you have FEES, but you don't have a similar thing in North America, or in somewhere like, I know Australia and New Zealand's informally or formally collaborate with one another, but it might be worthwhile looking at how you might formalize that. There's quite a lot of similarities, for example, in things like the distances between you and everyone else, or even in Australia, that can be the same. The distance between Sydney and Perth is enormous by European standards. I mean, it stretches like across Europe and into Asia if you just look at the actual geographical distance. And I say, so there's a lot of these sorts of distance, and how do you do things across a distance education systems, online systems, and we translate that into other types of work practices like telemedicine or other types of telehealth. So there's a lot of ways in which I think there's a lot of shared ideas that you could do to collaborate and build and strengthen one another. And there's also ways in which you can help grow within the region too. Where does that region end? Does it end with places like Papua New Guinea, the Pacific Island nations? How do you grow it across there? It might be exciting opportunities.
Well, speaking about exciting opportunities, we've got the next Congress next year, which brings your term to a close too, actually, doesn't it?
I gave a thumbs up because there's both a positive and a negative to that. But yes.
So tell us a bit about London and what's planned there.
Yeah, so you've caught me off guard in terms of the dates. It's in August,
yes.
And it's in London, IEA 2027. It's being held at the Excel Centre, which is in the east side of London. The closest airport, which is actually about 10 minutes away from the venue by public transport, is London City Airport. But if you fly into London Heathrow, there is the Elizabeth line, which you don't even have to hop off the train. The Elizabeth line goes straight to the Excel Centre. So it's fairly easy to get to. 3 days of conference, which is a bit shorter than we normally we have 4 days. So it's going to be a pretty packed program. At the moment, we don't have a scientific program together, but essentially the organising committee is looking at trying to create themes. So we have theme days rather than just having random sessions across multiple days. The idea is to try to pack things together into themes that people can, for example, come for 1 or 2 days rather than the whole 3 days. Unless, of course, you're interested in multiple areas and you're engaged in all sorts of other things. There's some exciting social events which are planned. It's right on the Thames, so you can imagine what types of social events are currently being planned, which might involve a little bit of water. And of course, this is it's a wonderful opportunity and it is the best opportunity to bring people involved in human factors and ergonomics from around the world together. It's usually the largest international conference. It engages across all the different areas of human factors and ergonomics, and more importantly, it gives you an opportunity to socialize and learn from people around the world. What greater opportunity to go and learn about how China is growing exponentially in its number of ergonomics programs and membership. How do they do that? How are they doing that? What are their challenges, and what are their challenges that we share with them? And I know one of them, which you definitely share with them, is issues around this growth in home delivery services, and doing this at a distance, for example.
We look forward to that. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. And congratulations to you. I just noticed on the website you seem to be travelling a lot. I don't know whether you've counted how many international trips yourself you have done, but there seems to be most corners of the world you visited. Would that be right?
Most. I haven't got to Antarctica yet. They don't have a very strong human factors and ergonomics program down there. There hasn't been much call, but yes, pretty much around the world. It's been terribly exciting, but it's also been an enormous growth opportunity, a learning opportunity for me. I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to engage with so many excited, motivated people from around the world. It really is a great privilege.
It is. I can concur. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you for joining the HFESA podcast series. And we look forward to seeing you in London.
Indeed. Keep well, and thanks very much, David.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.